Day by day our lives are turning, like a potter's wheel they spin. You are choosing your own maker. Choose your potter's wheel, my friend.
Matthew 24 gets used pretty often to talk about the rapture. Specifically, Matthew 24, 40 through 42. It says, "Then there shall be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming." Perhaps you don't realize it, but this text is not about the rapture. Now, before you run to the comments to tell me how wrong I am, consider this. Well-known prophecy scholars like Walvoord, Pentecost, and Tim LaHaye, they believe making this a rapture text is a misuse of this text, although Hal Lindsey bucked that trend. Well, it certainly looks like a rapture text, doesn't it? Before we finished, I hope we'll have learned that when it comes to interpreting Bible passages, we cannot assume they mean what they look like. We must actually study the text to understand Matthew 24. So let's go back to Matthew 23. Remember how important context is when we interpret Scripture. Context is king. Matthew 23, 32 through 39 actually sets the stage for Christ's prophecy in Matthew 24. Unfortunately, it never occurs to people that they're beginning their study too late when they start studying in Matthew 24:29. It's tempting to get to the exciting stuff, but not helpful when we end up misinterpreting what Jesus says. Back in chapter 23, Jesus said he would send apostles and prophets, and they would be rejected. Jesus then grouped these Jewish leaders together with their forefathers, accusing them of rejecting God's messengers. The blood of those prophets would fall upon the heads of the generation to which Jesus was speaking. Then Jesus offered a lamentation over Jerusalem because of her impending destruction, a judgment that would come because of millennia of rejection. As we begin to read Matthew 24, we're told that Jesus and the disciples were coming out of the temple and that the disciples were pointing out the buildings. From a human standpoint, they had good reason to marvel at these buildings. History tells us that Herod's temple was an architectural wonder. It was built with great attention to detail, and no expense was spared in making it beautiful. However, Matthew has a different reason for telling us about the disciples' admiration given toward these buildings. It's because Jesus was about to say, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down." This is in Matthew 24:2. Jesus told them this grand temple that amazed them would be destroyed. Keep in mind that they had just heard Jesus' prophecy of destruction in that generation. That's in 23, verses 25 through 39. So let's be sure we see this. The disciples are talking about how wonderful the buildings are, and Jesus tells them those buildings would be destroyed. It must have seemed impossible that such a grand and massive structure that surely is the center of God's intentions might be torn down in the near future. So later, as they were sitting on the Mount of Olives, which, by the way, it affords a magnificent view of the Temple Mount, the disciples asked Jesus about his statement of destruction. Notice how they ask their question. "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" This is in verse 3 of chapter 24. They obviously think that these things, the destruction of the temple, will come about at the end of the age. And why not? They're Jews and couldn't begin to believe the temple would not be at the center or heart of what Jesus was about to do. All their lives, the temple had been the center of religion directed toward God. They had become convinced that Jesus was the Messiah and certainly thought the temple must become the center of attention for his coming kingdom. How could it be destroyed now? It must be a long way off. Although the disciples thought they were asking one question, They had actually asked two questions. When will these things be, the destruction of the temple, does not address the same point in time as the end of the age. When these things would take place will be answered in a discussion of the temple's destruction. Then Jesus will address the end of the age and his coming as a second question. Unfortunately, our time is up for this study, but we've established the setting for this incredibly interesting chapter, and we're ready to study the answer Jesus gave his disciples. Be sure and return for our next study as we search for the true meaning of Matthew 24 and come to understand how those words that sound so much like the rapture actually are not.